Mrs. Pantry was deeply immersed in sleep, dreaming that she had won the first prize at the flower show. She was thoroughly enjoying her dream, as she did every morning, until her enjoyment was interrupted by the arrival of the morning tea. Somewhere in her unconscious inner feeling, she began to register the usual morning noises in the house: the sound of curtain rings running on their track as the maid opened the curtains, the sounds of a sweeping bucket and brush as the other maid cleaned the hallway outside her room, and from afar, the heavy sound of the front door latch being drawn. It was common for this racket to continue for another half hour without causing Mrs. Pantry any disturbance, because she had grown used to the length and repetition of it, until it was interrupted by the precise, light-footed steps across the hallway and the rustling of a light dress, followed by the muffled clinking of tea utensils as the tray was placed on the table outside the room. All of this would finally end with a soft knock on the door, after which the maid Mary would enter to open the curtains. Another day was beginning, and in the meantime, she had to extract as much enjoyment as possible from the flower show before the dream was interrupted by waking. Mrs. Pantry frowned in her sleep, for something disturbing was penetrating her dream, something out of place, hurried and very insistent footsteps. Her ears unconsciously strained to hear the sounds of tea utensils being placed on the tray outside the door, but she did not hear any of that. Then came the knock at the door, and from the depths of her dream, Mrs. Pantry said mechanically, "Come in, open the door. You will hear the clinking of the rings when the curtains are opened." But she did not hear the clinking of the curtain rings. Instead, she heard Mary's voice. It was a breathless, hysterical sound as Mary said, "Oh, Sydney, oh my lady, there is a body in the library." Mrs. Pantry was jolted out of the room, bursting into tears in a hysterical manner. She sat up in bed. Either her dream had taken a very strange turn or Mary had actually burst into the room and said there was a body in the library. It was an unbelievable thing. Mrs. Pantry told herself it was impossible. She must have been dreaming. But even as she said that, she felt an increasing confidence that she was not dreaming and that Mary, her usually composed maid, had indeed uttered those fantastic words. Mrs. Pantry thought for a moment and then prodded her sleeping husband, saying, "Arthur, Arthur, wake up." Colonel Pantry murmured and mumbled and turned on his side. "Get up, Arthur, did you hear what she said?" Colonel Pantry mumbled, "It's quite likely, I quite agree with you, Dolly." Then he went back to sleep. So Mrs. Pantry shook him, saying, "You need to listen. Mary came in and said there is a body in the library." "What? A body in the library? Who said that?" "Mary." Colonel Pantry gathered his wits and prepared to deal with the situation. He said kindly, "You must have been dreaming, Dolly. It's that detective story you've been reading. The broken matchstick clue where Lord Egbanson finds a blonde beauty dead on the carpet in front of the fireplace in the library. Bodies in novels are always found in libraries, but I've never come across a real case like that in real life. Perhaps you are convinced now. Anyway, you need to get up and see for yourself." "What do you want me to do? Go downstairs and ask if there is a body in the library? I'll look foolish." "There's no need to ask anything. It's quite possible that Mary has gone mad and is seeing things that aren't there. But if there is a body, someone will soon tell you about it, and you won't have to say a word." Colonel Pantry wrapped his robe around him, mumbled, and left the room. He walked down the hallway and then down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs, a group of servants was gathered, some of them sobbing and crying. The butler came forward solemnly and said, "I'm glad you came, sir. I instructed that nothing be done until you arrived. Is it appropriate to call the police, sir?" "About what should I call the police?" The butler cast a reproachful look at the tall maid who was sobbing hysterically on the cook's shoulder and said, "I understood that Mary told you, and she said she did." Mary gasped, saying, "I was so upset I didn't know what I said. I was struck with panic again and felt nauseous when I found her like that. Oh, my God." Then she relaxed again on Mrs. Eccles' shoulder, who said with some relief, There, dear, enough now." The butler said, "It's natural that Mary is a bit upset, sir, considering she made that terrible discovery. She went into the library as usual to open the curtains and nearly stumbled over the body." Colonel Pantry asked, "Are you telling me there is a body in the library, in my library?" The butler cleared his throat and said, "Perhaps you'd like to see it for yourself, sir?" Hello, this is Constable Pollock. Yes, who is speaking?" Constable Pollock was adjusting the buttons of his official coat with one hand and holding the receiver with the other. Yes, Gossington Hall, yes? Oh, good morning, sir. The tone of Constable Pollock changed slightly, becoming more respectful and patient as he recognized the voice of the county chief and generous patron of the police sports. Yes, sir, how can I assist you? I'm sorry, sir, I didn't catch that. Did you say a body? Yes, if you please, sir, indeed. Sir, did you say she is an unknown young woman? Certainly, sir, yes, you may leave everything to me. Constable Pollock replaced the receiver and blew a long whistle, then started calling his superior. Miss Marple's phone rang as she was getting dressed. The sound startled her a bit as it was a time she wasn't used to receiving calls. Her life of spinsterhood was organized to the point where unexpected phone calls became a source of much speculation. Miss Marple said, looking with some puzzlement at the device, "Oh my, who could this be?" The time between 9 and 9:30 was the agreed-upon time in the village for friendly phone calls with neighbors, and plans for the day and invitations were all made in these calls. The butcher was known to call before 9 if there was an urgent matter in the meat trade, and occasional short calls occurred during the day, although calls after 9:30 at night were considered ill-mannered. True, Miss Marple's nephew, a writer, thus unpredictable, was known for calling at odd times, once even 10 minutes before midnight. But neither his nor any of Miss Marple's acquaintances' peculiarities included calling before 8 in the morning, especially not at a time like 7:45. This time is too early even for a telegram, as the post office doesn't open until 8. Miss Marple decided to herself, it must be a wrong number. She moved forward, having decided that, to the noisy phone, and lifted the receiver saying, "Yes? Is this you, Jane?" Miss Marple was quite surprised. "Yes, it's Jane. You're up early, Dolly." "Mrs. Pantry's voice came breathless and excited over the wire. "Something the most dreadful has happened." "Oh, heavens! We've just found a body in the library." For a moment, Miss Marple thought her friend had gone mad. "You found what? It's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, I thought things like that only happened in novels. I had to argue with Arthur for hours this morning before he went downstairs to see." Miss Marple tried to compose herself, then asked in a breathless voice, "But who is it?" "It's a blonde girl." "What? A blonde girl, a beautiful blonde, just like in the novels. None of us has ever seen her before. She's lying there in the library, dead, and you need to come here right away." "You want me to come?" "Yes, and I'll send a car for you." Miss Marple replied anxiously, "Of course, dear, if you think my presence might provide some comfort to you." "I don't want comfort." "But you're excellent when it comes to matters of murder. You killed this girl, strangled her, and I feel that if one must accept that a murder has actually happened in their home, they might as well enjoy it, if you know what I mean. Therefore, I want you to come and help me find out who did it. Let's solve the mystery. It's really quite exciting, isn't it?" "Of course, my dear, I will not fall short if I can help you." "Wonderful. Arthur is a bit strict. He seems to think I shouldn't enjoy this at all. I know it's very sad, but after all, I don't know the girl, and when you see her, you'll understand what I mean when I say she doesn't seem real at all." Miss Marple got out of the Pantry family car, slightly out of breath. The driver opened the door for her, and Colonel Pantry came out onto the front steps, looking slightly surprised as he said, "Miss Marple, I'm pleased to see you. I was called by your wife." Good. She must have someone with her, or she would have collapsed. She's been facing the situation bravely so far, but you know how things are." At that moment, Mrs. Pantry appeared and exclaimed, "Go back to the dining room and have your breakfast, Arthur. It will get cold." Colonel Pantry explained, "I thought the inspector would be here any moment, so it's important that you have your breakfast first. You need it. And you too, you'd better come and eat something, Dolly." "I'll be there in a minute. Come on, Arthur." Colonel Pantry was pushed back to the dining room as one might push a stubborn chicken, and Mrs. Pantry said triumphantly, "Now, let's go." She quickly led her guest to the east side of the house and outside the library door, where policeman Polk stood guard. He stopped Mrs. Pantry with a decisive gesture, saying, "I'm afraid no one is allowed to enter." "Madam, it's the inspector's orders." "You know Miss Marple well enough," said Mrs. Pantry. "It's very important for Miss Marple to see the body." "Don't be foolish, Polk. Besides, it's my library, isn't it? Policeman Polk, who had always been accustomed to yielding to country gentry, thought there was no need to inform the inspector of this, but he warned the two ladies, "You mustn't touch anything in any way." "Mrs. Pantry said with a tone of patience, "Of course, we know that. You can come in and watch us if you like." Policeman Polk allowed himself to benefit from this permission, as it was what he had intended anyway, and Mrs. Pantry proudly led her friend through the library to the old, large fireplace, then dramatically said, "There." Miss Marple then understood what her friend meant when she said the girl wasn't real. The library was exactly as its owners were, vast, shabby, and untidy, with sagging armchairs, a large table covered with papers, and old paintings of family ancestors. There were also Victorian watercolor paintings and some hunting scenes that were supposed to be amusing. In the corner was a large vase with some flowers. The whole room was somewhat dim and showed signs of extensive use and intimacy with the past. At the end of the small, worn-out rug in front of the fireplace lay the girl's body, with her arms outstretched. She had unnaturally blonde hair that had been styled into organized waves and curls. Her slender body was dressed in a shiny white satin evening gown, and her face was heavily made up, with strange, comical rouge on its swollen, blue surface, and smeared lipstick that looked like a wound. Her red-painted nails looked like blood. It was an eye-catching, garish body, completely out of harmony with the old-fashioned comfort suggested by Colonel Pantry's library. "Mrs. Pantry said in a low voice, did you see what I mean? She's simply not real." The old woman standing beside her nodded in agreement, and after a long look at the slumped body, she finally said in a quiet voice, "She's very young." Yes, I suppose so." Mrs. Pantry seemed almost astonished, as if she had made a discovery. Miss Marple didn't touch the girl but looked at the fingers gripping the front of the gown as if they had grabbed it with their nails in a last desperate struggle for breath. The sound of a car crunching on gravel outside was heard, and Policeman Polk quickly and insistently said, "That must be the inspector." Believing firmly that country gentry would not disappoint, Mrs. Pantry immediately moved to the door, followed by Miss Marple, who said, "It will be all right, Polk," and Polk immediately felt relieved. The Colonel Pantry stepped out into the hall after finishing the last bits of his toast and coffee. When he looked out the window, he was relieved to see Colonel Milchett, the county police chief, getting out of the car with Inspector Slack. Milchett was a friend of the colonel, while Slack was not liked much by him, as he was an energetic man who often expressed his disdain through his diligent manner. "Good morning, Pantry," said the police chief. "I thought it best to come myself. This seems very strange." It's incredible. I can hardly believe it." "Didn't you recognize the woman at all? Have you seen her before?" asked Inspector Slack. The housekeeper was just as shocked as I was. Yes, I can understand that perfectly. I hope your wife isn't too shaken by the whole thing. She was wonderful, really wonderful, and she brought Miss Marple to be here, the one who lives in the village." The police chief said, "Miss Marple? Why did you call for her?" "Well, the woman needs another woman, don't you see?" Colonel Milchett said with a light laugh. "I see that your wife will try her hand at amateur detective work. Miss Marple is, in a sense, the local sleuth. She bested us once, didn't she, Mallory?" Inspector Slack replied, "That was different." "Differently how?" "That was a local case. Miss Marple knows everything that happens in the village." "That's true, but she's no help in this case." Milchett replied curtly, "You yourself don't know much about the case yet, Slack." "Ah, wait a minute, sir, it won't be long before I get to the bottom of it." In the dining room, Mrs. Pantry and Miss Marple were having their breakfast. After Mrs. Pantry had served her guest, she asked insistently, "Well, what do you think, Jane?" Miss Marple looked up after taking a small portion and said, "No, I can't say it reminds me of anything, not at the moment. The sight of the girl did remind me a bit of Edie, Mrs. Chitty's younger daughter, but I think it was only because this poor girl was chewing her nails and her front teeth were slightly protruding." Miss Marple continued her comparison, and of course, Edie was also fond of cheap makeup. "Do you mean her clothes?" "Yes, the Satan is very flashy and of poor quality." "I know, perhaps it is from one of those shops that sell everything." Then Mrs. Pantry said with hope, "Wait a moment. What happened to Eddie, Chitty's daughter?" "She recently moved to a different job, and I assume she is doing very well. Mrs. Pantry felt a bit disappointed, as this rural example didn't seem very encouraging. She said, "What I don't understand is why she was in Arthur's office. Polk told me that the window had been forced open. Maybe she had come here with a thief, and they had a fight, but that seems utterly silly, doesn't it?" Miss Merrill said thoughtfully, "Her clothes hardly fit the idea of coming for a theft." "Yes, she was wearing evening wear, probably for some kind of party, but there is nothing of that sort here or anywhere," Miss Merrill said with suspicion. "Yes." Mrs. Pantry pressed on, "You have something in mind, Jean." "I was just wondering." "About what?" "Basil Blake." Mrs. Pantry exclaimed involuntarily, "Oh, no." She then added as if explaining, "I know his mother." The two women exchanged glances, and Miss Merrill said, "I understand exactly how you feel about it. Sylvia Blake is the most imaginable sweet woman, and the hedgerow she has split in her garden is truly amazing, which made me one of them a lot, and she is very generous with her seedlings," Miss Merrill said, dismissing the praise for Mrs. Blake. "Nevertheless, there has been a lot of talk." "Yes, I know, and of course, Arthur flies into a rage when he hears Basil Blake's name. He was really very rude to Arthur, and since then Arthur won't tolerate any kind words about him. He has that ridiculous, insulting way of speaking that young men these days have, and of course, his clothes. People say that it doesn't matter what you wear in the countryside." "What nonsense! In the countryside, people are the only ones who notice what you wear." She paused for a moment and then added with a bit of gloom, "He was a wonderful child when he was younger. I saw a lovely picture of the killer, Cheviot, last Sunday when he was a child." "Oh, but Jean, I don't think you suspect he is the one who—" "No, no, dear, that would be a gross leap of results. I was just trying to explain the young woman's presence here. St. Marymead is a place far from that." Then it seemed to me that the only possible explanation is Basil Blake. He does indeed host parties, and people come to him from London and from the studios where he works. Do you remember what happened last July? All that shouting and singing, such a chaotic mess, and the mess they left behind in broken glass the next morning was simply unbelievable. This is what old Mrs. Perry told me. Mrs. Pantry said indulgently, "I'm glad they were those who work in films." "That is most likely, and there is, I think, something you've heard about recently. Over some recent weekend breaks, Basil Blake had a young woman with him, a platinum blonde." Mrs. Pantry exclaimed, "Do you think it was her?" "Actually, I wondered. I didn't see her in person, of course, but just fleetingly as she was getting in or out of the car, but I didn't actually face her. And all those girls with their makeup and hair look very similar." "Yes, it could be her. It's an idea, Jean.